Hello, and welcome to the ALevelRE Flip Learning podcast. Today's talk is about religious language. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the impact a movement called logical positivism had on 20th century philosophy. The idea of this talk is for you to listen, take notes if you wish to, and then respond to the retrieval questions afterwards. You can stop and replay this at any time to make sure you understand what it is I'm talking about. I'm going to assume you do have some prior knowledge of philosophy, but be aware there are quite a lot of technical terms which we'll need to look at closely to ensure we understand what's being said. There are also some reflection questions which are intended to be used for a class discussion following this talk. However, it might be useful to have a think about them and jot down some of your notes in response to them in preparation for your next lesson. Okay, let's look at slide number 2. In the middle of the slide, you'll see the statement, God exists. When believers make this claim, they are stating or confirming something which they believe is fundamentally true. There really is a God out there, and he really does exist in a real sense. It's what's called a truth claim, and there are other truth claims which are central to different faiths. In Islam, there's the Shahada, a statement which confirms the existence of God and the appointment of Muhammad as his messenger. In Christianity, for example, there's the affirmation of the resurrection of Christ, or the Immaculate Conception. And for followers of these religions, these claims are true. They are facts. This approach is known as realism. Realism is about what's real. It's a philosophical approach which stems from Aristotle, and it's concerned with the properties of things. When it comes to describing objects or talking about something, there is a truth which can be established. For example, if I say the ball I'm holding in my hand is red, and you say it's blue, then one of us is correct and the other one isn't. It's quite easy to establish whether the ball I'm holding in my hand is blue or whether it's red. We just have to look at it, and we can easily determine who is right and who is wrong. In the same way then, when believers and philosophers are talking about God and making truth claims, they are talking about things which they believe can be known. Ultimately, they accept that they are either right or wrong, but they are wagering, having faith, that they are correct. This approach is saying the language we use is cognitive language. Have a look at slide 3. Cognition involves perceiving and processing knowledge, so when believers make these truth claims, they're talking about facts which convey knowledge. Okay, slide number 4. In the 1920s, a group of philosophers, scientists and mathematicians really began to get to grips with what we mean when we use language to debate and discuss what's true. Led by the German philosopher Maurice Schlick, this group became known as the Vienna Circle, and they'd meet every week to discuss philosophy. They were witnessing enormous breakthroughs in science at the time, and they were heavily influenced by the work of Albert Einstein. And they felt that in order for philosophy to be taken seriously, knowledge, or what we claim to know, must be scrutinized in the same way that scientific hypotheses are scrutinized. So, if we make a claim that we cannot know to be factually true or false, then it's just a waste of time talking about it. It just boils down to opinion. If we're trying to establish the truth of a statement, which implies who is right and who is wrong, then we need to know the facts. And if we want to have meaningful, worthwhile discussions, or to claim knowledge of something, then we have to be able to show that it's factually true. Now, this isn't a new approach to philosophy, although it had been overshadowed by other trends in philosophical thinking during the 19th century, but it's rooted in the epistemology of Hume and influenced by Descartes' need to establish with absolute certainty whatever we're claiming to know. However, the impact on 20th century philosophy was really significant because it called for a complete reassessment of what truth implies. One of the members of the Vienna Circle, Friedrich Waismann, said, "A statement which cannot be conclusively verified cannot be verified at all. It is devoid of meaning." Now, there's a really important word in that, conclusively. for something to be conclusively demonstrated to be true or conclusively verified, that means 100%. We cannot be in any way misled. It has to be absolutely sure that what we are talking about is true or what we're talking about is false. Another of those present in the meetings of the Vienna Circle was a young Oxford philosopher called A.J. Ayer, or Freddie Ayer. Now, look at slide number 5 and you'll see a picture of him. In his book, which was published in 1936 called Language, Truth and Logic, Ayer develops what's called the verification principle. And that is what he used to establish whether or not a statement is meaningful or not. So for Ayer, any statement which can't be demonstrated to be analytically true or synthetically true was completely meaningless, and therefore to discuss it would be just a waste of time. Now let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. Firstly, analytic statements. Analytic statements are true by definition, and the knowledge that we gain from analytic statements is a priori knowledge. Now that literally means from the one which came before, and it's established through logical reasoning. So for example, an analytical statement might be a circle is round. So that statement is true by definition. In order for a shape to be a circle, it must be round. It can't be any other shape. Either the shape we're talking about, therefore, is a circle or it's not. If I say it's a circle and you say it's a rectangle, then one of us is correct and the other is not. Now, this kind of statement is quite different from synthetic statements. These statements are those which can be empirically, that means scientifically tested using our sensory experience. And knowledge gained from synthetic statements is a posteriori, which literally means from that which comes after, and it's established through sensory experience. So for example, if I say there's a squirrel in that tree, I can look and see if there really is a squirrel in the tree. Now, if there is, then the statement is true. If there isn't, then the statement is false. Either way, the statement itself has meaning. It doesn't matter if it's true or whether it's false, it still has meaning, and we're not wasting our time trying to establish whether there really is a squirrel in the tree, because we know exactly the criteria we need to prove it to be true, and we have to see it. For Ayer then, any statement about God or judgment or afterlife, angels, grace, sin, redemption, etc. is completely void of meaning. It doesn't matter whether I'm taking the theist's position and saying God exists, or the atheist's position and saying God doesn't exist. Both statements are equally meaningless because they are neither analytic nor synthetic. Now, according to Ayer, it's not an analytic statement because there's nothing in the definition of God which implies existence. Now, you might want to revisit this when you look at the ontological argument, but for Ayer, at least, that's not an analytic statement, and therefore it cannot be taken to be meaningful. In addition, the statement God exists can't be a synthetic statement either, because God, being transcendent, is outside of space and time, and so not subject to the laws of science. We can't subject claims about God to empirical or scientific testing, so we can't establish with any certainty whether what we're claiming is true or not. And, if I was to say, for example, God spoke to me in a dream, we can't know for certain whether that's true or not. There's no way of testing it. We don't know the criteria we would need in order to judge whether it's true or not. And so, according to Ayer, it's a waste of time even discussing it. It's completely meaningless. Now, this approach is called strong verification. Have a look at slide number 6. And it's not without its problems. It reduces most of our human interactions, where we might express emotions or opinions, to nonsense, and it discounts many statements which we would still maintain are meaningful. So in the red box there you've got a series of examples. Let's look at the first one. I love my mum. Now, I think that has meaning. I hope my mum would see that as having meaning too, but for Ayer, it doesn't. It's a meaningless statement. There's nothing analytically true about it. There's nothing that's true by definition, and you can't empirically test it. The next one is an important one because Ayer actually had quite a lot to say about ethics. You may have come across Ayer, in fact, if you've done a unit on metaethics. If I say murder is wrong, then Ayer says all we're really saying about it is that we don't like it, we find it distasteful. Boo to murder. There's nothing analytic about that statement. There's nothing in the definition of murder which automatically makes it wrong, and it's not a synthetic statement either, and therefore it cannot be claimed to be factually true. Therefore it's not meaningful. Historical statements such as William of Normandy won the Battle of Hastings in 1066. There's no way of assessing whether that is true or not empirically, and of course there's nothing analytically true about that statement, so that's meaningless. And in addition, statements about the future. There's life on planet Neptune. There's nothing analytical about that statement, and we can't test it to see if it's true, so it's not synthetically true either. Now that means, according to the strong verification principle, all of those four statements are completely meaningless. Now, in response, Ayer modified his position a little bit. He recognised that is perhaps a little bit too strong a position, and he put forward what's called the weak verification principle. The strong verification principle, if you remember from the quote from Weissman that we just looked at, requires absolute certainty before we can declare a statement to be meaningful. Now, the weak version of the principle that Ayer also put forward simply requires that there is a strong likelihood of the truth of a statement, given the evidence we have before us. So, quote from Ayer there, a proposition is viable in the strong sense if and only if its truth can be conclusively established. But it's verifiable in the weak sense if it's possible for experience to render it probable. So that word probable is really, really important. It means that as long as we know what criteria we need to prove a statement to be true or not, we can still accept it as meaningful and, crucially, still spend time and effort discussing it. This means that historical statements do still have meaning according to the weak verification principle, because if we have sufficient evidence to make it probable, so for example we can say with some degree of certainty, although not absolute certainty, that William of Normandy did indeed win the Battle of Hastings in 1066 because of the documents and sources which date from the time. Equally, we may at some point develop in the future the technology necessary to travel to Neptune and conduct the scientific experiments we need to find out if there's life there or not. This means as long as we know by what criteria we would judge it to be true or false, the statements or the claims can still be considered meaningful according to the weak verification principle. Now, this modification is absolutely crucial for religious language. So while any statement about God was considered meaningless according to the strong verification principle, and while many of the statements which concern the supernatural are still discounted, so if I was to say, my soul sang in the presence of the Lord, there's absolutely nothing meaningful about that statement to a logical positivist. Some truth claims, if we apply the weak verification principle, could potentially still be shown to be meaningful. As you'll find out next time, John Hick picked up on the weak verification principle to argue that religious statements can indeed still have meaning, due to the possibility of eschatological verification. But that's for another podcast and another lesson. For now, it's just really important that you understand logical positivism as an analytic philosophical movement, the difference between the strong verification principle and the weak verification principle, and crucially, the impact this had on any discussion about God. Now, I always think it's important to remember that philosophy is a conversation, essentially, and so it always reflects the society and worldview of its day. Now, this is one of the reasons that the Vienna Circle was so interested in the scientific method. They're influenced by Albert Einstein and his discoveries and everything that was going on at the time. And philosophers can always be found to have similar ideas to philosophers who came before them. And one of the key things to be able to do is to identify similar strands in their thinking. For example, Ayer, who we've been talking about today, came directly after Bertrand Russell. Now, you might have come across Russell before, perhaps when looking at the cosmological argument, because in his 1948 radio debate with Freddie Copleston about the origins of the universe, Russell famously dismissed any discussion of a cause by saying it's just brute fact. Now, this is because, like Ayer, he found any discussion of it a waste of time because we're unable to prove it empirically. And indeed, this focus on empiricism, this scientific testing, really goes back to the Enlightenment and David Hume, who claimed that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. So if it can't be proven to be true using scientific testing, it should just be dismissed. So this kind of thinking is not really unique to Ayer, but it does mean that the whole movement of logical positivism is really useful for you to get to grips with, because it crops up as a criticism in so many areas of religious philosophy. You can use it to criticize religious experiences, miracles, life after death, classical arguments for the existence of God, etc. So it is really worth your while getting familiar with it. Okay, so that's the end of the talk for this time. There are the retrieval questions, which is just really to make sure that you understand what I've been talking about today and to make sure that you have some really good notes about it that you can bring to your next class. And there are also some reflection questions. Now, the reflection questions are really designed to be discussed in class with your teacher and your colleagues, that are designed to help you really get to grips with the impact and the implications of what it is that we're talking about in this talk. So if we look at some of those reflection questions, the first one says, do believers always talk about God in terms of facts? Well, from some of the examples that I've given in my talk, you'll realize that no, actually, believers don't always talk about God in terms of facts or truth claims. They talk about God in terms of the relationship that they have, the emotions that they feel, the impact that it has on their life, and lots of other ways. So what kinds of ways could you identify, and how might those be used to push back against the criticism or the challenge from logical positivism? Your second question, I think, is a really important question to really reflect upon. In philosophical debate or dialogue, how important is it for there always to be a winner? I'm right, you're wrong. Is that really what we're trying to do when we talk to other people? Or could the conversations that we have any other purpose or value? And number 3, which is really important to move forward with this, is the weak verification principle accepts that there only needs to be enough evidence to make the truth of a statement probable. Now, that's a bit of a grey area type word. Do you think there is sufficient evidence to suggest God's existence is probable? What kind of evidence might people put forward? And how convincing do you think that would be? So, hope you've enjoyed the talk. If you need to go back and listen to anything again, of course you can. and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for listening.